Captain Brooks. Take two.
There we go.
In 1859, this island was first officially, quote-unquote, discovered by a fellow by the name of Captain N.B. Brooks. I don't know what the N stands for, I don't know what the B stands for.
Stevie probably knows.
I know.
It was his
hear it.
close relative.
Yeah.
Great uncle.
Yeah, it was Norman.
Norman Bates.
Norman Baylor Brooks. Didn't you know that?
Norman Baylor Brooks. So Norman Baylor Brooks discovered Midway Atoll in 1859. Like I said, he didn't do a very good job of charting the exact position of the island. Now I got to take a quick step back in time here and sort of make a comment that it's actually fairly statistically unlikely that he was indeed the very first person to locate these islands. Since 1829 there had been over 400 whalers operating only out of Honolulu. It's not to mention all the whalers and how many hundreds more were operating out of Japan, the Japanese main islands, China. The Philippines had some whalers that would venture as far as the North Central Pacific. And with the competition so fierce, they certainly weren't willing to just kind of operate in their own little zones and operate in the sea lanes that had already been established. So the probability that at least one of them had happened across the islands here is pretty high. Of course, this is a paradise compared to what Midway used to look like. It used to be, as you guys know, about 2/3 of the size, this main island here. There was no artificial entrance into the harbor. There's a very, very hazardous natural entrance where the reef has been pounded into oblivion to the west of us. But a sailor that would happen across this little place in the middle of nowhere would probably be thinking, God forbid I ever have to stop here again, you know? So it's likely that whoever did notice this island, or these couple of islands, decided it wasn't even worth mentioning when they made it back home. Probably on some captain's log somewhere buried in some basement of some museum, there is reference to sightings in this vicinity, but nobody ever really took the initiative and pushed it. But Captain Brooks did. He reported this to the U.S. Navy Department. And they took a little bit of interest in it, but
We'll move.
Traffic jam.
This one stay in the shade.
the United States government took some mild interest in the islands here, but in all honesty, the reaction wasn't spectacular. Probably the greatest reaction was on the part of a commercial entity. It was a Pacific steamship company that was handling Trans-Pacific mail. And Trans-Pacific mail by ship was regular service, was a fairly new phenomenon at the time. And they were looking at Midway as a possible coaling depot. And of course, they knew that if a coaling depot was established out here, maybe as well as a steamship company knew that government contracts would probably be forthcoming shortly thereafter. So they applied to the Navy Department and to whatever United States other federal agencies might have been necessary for permission to come out here and survey the island. And so, in conjunction with the United States Navy and elements of the Northern Pacific Squadron, the United States Navy did authorize an expedition out here. Well, it never happened because of the American Civil War. From 1861 to 1864, of course, we were locked in a great struggle. And the American Civil War actually was probably the event that really focused Midway into a location the United States really was interested in locating, discovering, charting accurately, and developing. And that's because Nassau, in the Bahamas, I believe, was a location for Confederate commerce raiders. Cruisers, big ironclad cruisers, would raid commerce up and down the seaboard, eastern seaboard, and then would, head back to Nassau, which was a British protectorate, and would get repairs, would be able to, hang out when it got a little bit too hot out there, and they were very, very effective. And the United States Navy, of course, not wanting to bring England into the war directly against the North, couldn't really do anything about it, and it was an enormous thorn in our side. The Alabama and the Florida were the most effective Confederate raiders, and they were the two particular vessels that participated in these commerce raids. Well, a lot of lessons are learned in any war, and that was one lesson that was learned in the Civil War as far as the naval element was concerned. You know, we can't have these hostile little enclaves so close to, you know, highly strategic areas. You know, sea zones are vital. Every war has proven that. And so, Midway, all of a sudden, Navy planners, you know, future war planners, remembered this little spit of sand out about 1,200 miles, give or take, northwest of Honolulu. And so $50,000 was authorized for an expedition to come out here and dredge an artificial harbor. And $50,000, of course, doesn't go very far today, and it sure didn't go very far back then when it came to something as monumental as dredging a harbor in a little remote island out in the middle of nowhere. So the money dried up real quick. They didn't complete their endeavor, and this was in 1867 when this was finished. About 3 years after the war between the North and South ended. So you have this island that has just been sucked up with a number of dollars from the federal government. There's nothing to show for it. Things are kind of cooling down a little bit. There's no direct threat in the Pacific to warrant, you know, massive buildup on Midway. Certainly Honolulu, even at that time, isn't seeing the sort of money that it deserved. So you had sort of a quiet period, about 30 years of quiet here on Midway. There were no permanent American residents. The Japanese had, a number of Japanese squatters would come out here and harvest goonie feathers and eggs from time to time. The goonie feathers, of course, were sort of in vogue all over the world at the time, especially the short-tailed albatross, which you might have heard there's only one here on the island. At one time, that was the most prolific albatross in the world. There were more short-tailed albatross than any other type of albatross. And they were just, because they're so much bigger and stupider than the rest of them here, they were so much easier to nab. And of course, their feathers were more highly prized than any of these other birds. So, by 1867, by the close of the 19th century, Midway still was fairly pristine. And then a brand new global development really focused on Midway for the very first time, and that was the completion of the very first around-the-world telegraph connection. Now, cable had been laid all over the world except for one swath of the Central Pacific. And initially, Midway wasn't even considered. They were going to finish the cable laying from the Hawaiian Islands to the Marshall Islands. It was a little bit longer of a route, but it's just as straight. There were harbor facilities on the Marshall Islands. There was a native population for a workforce. It was far superior to Midway in every possible way, shape, and form, except one thing. The Marshall Islands were a protectorate of Germany, and so it was foreign soil. And the United States government, after giving this a lot of thought, thought, well, you know, there's got to be a trade-off here. Do we want this to be all in American hands? Because even the cables in foreign countries were still considered sovereign American territory. And the way stations were, generally speaking, associated with ambassadorial status, and they were oftentimes integrated into ambassadorial territory and things of that nature. It wasn't not possible for one way or another, and I'm not sure exactly what the ramifications and the logistics of that were. But the Marshall Islands was not a very good political choice, and so they remembered Midway. It's close. Sure, they sunk some cash into it and they got nothing out of it. Sure, it's still very dangerous for ships to enter the harbor. But they decided to make a go of it. So the Pacific Cable Company, I don't remember the exact name of it. It's not military history, so it's not my forte. Came out here in 1903 and established their first little base of operations. And they erected actually 1899 is when they first came out here. They erected 4 temporary housing structures. They were made out of wood. There were no trees out here. Just a little bit of shrub brush at either end of the island. There's no grasses. There's no wasps, of course, which was a good thing. There was no centipedes. It was truly the pristine island that it had been for millennia. They didn't like it. They would write letters home describing how inhospitable and just how desolate this place was. The winds would come right over the island. They wouldn't stop for anything. The birds would be yipping and moaning and chirping and clapping 24 hours a day. They didn't like it at all. Of course, they missed their families. You know, there's nothing to do out here except count birds and count days. And so what they did is when they planned their permanent housing, which was completed in 1903, they also brought in grass, they brought in soils, they brought in the very first ironwood trees that we see all over both islands now, Eastern and Sand Island. they brought in, additionally, and you probably have seen a lot of parakeets around the island. They originally brought in 2 parakeets, and they were both yellow parakeets. And they additionally brought in, within about 6 months of the first permanent deployment out here in 1903 of cable house employees, when the permanent concrete structures were raised, they brought 6 more out here, so they had a grand total of 8 parent parakeets. And they released them into the wild, and now direct descendants of those parakeets, it's estimated there's between 2,500 and 4,000 parakeets in here right now, and they can all you know, draw back their lineage back to those original parakeets, and most of them the first 2 parakeets, as a matter of fact. So you had the American telegraph presence out here, and the around the world connection was complete. And on on New Year's Eve, either Christmas Eve or New Year's Eve, the telegraph company time is not my primary area of knowledge here, but one of those 2 dates, the very first around the world telegraph connection was made by Teddy Roosevelt. It took 9 minutes to originate the message in Washington, D.C. and to have it go all the way around the world, which at the time was just lightning fast. It would have taken months and months previously, because it would have had to been traveled by hand and passed off, you know, at location to location. So that's pretty much what this island, and you know what, I suppose we can start going a little bit, because that's kind of the cable house times, and then we're going to start getting into a little bit of military history. So let's go a little bit forward. And by the way, let me just kind of mention, if you see anything, because I'm going to focus primarily on the military history, as you'll see here shortly. If you see anything on the island that I don't mention and you're interested, go ahead and point it out. I do skip over a lot of stuff, a lot of the aspects of history that don't directly deal with the Second World War. But just let me know. Shoot any questions out, any clarifications, just go ahead and send them on my way, because we're not really on a tight schedule or anything like that. As a matter of fact, you guys have 4.5 hours of my time. You're right. And I'll just kind of digress here. These 5-inch guns were installed in 1940, and I'm going to kind of jump around time frames here. These were installed when the very first Marine Expeditionary Force landed on Midway, that turned into the Marine defensive attachment here for the Battle of Midway, for the entirety of the war, as a matter of fact. There were 2 batteries of these 5-inch guns here on Sand Island, and there were 2 batteries on Eastern Island. Now I counted to a grand total of about 8 guns. Now they had 5-inch guns here in Midway. They also had 3-inch guns. And there's one 3-inch gun that's remaining on Eastern Island. Any of you that went to Eastern Island probably saw that near the dock when you got off. And also on Eastern Island, they had 2 8-inch guns, which was massive. Structurally, they're about the mechanisms are about 3 times the size of these 5-inch guns, so you get some idea just how big these cannons were. And this was the very first actual memorial established for the Battle of Midway. It's kind of been a little bit of disrepair right now. I don't want to say disrepair, it's kind of dirty. That's something that we're gonna be cleaning up here before too long. And I was mentioning the other day, yeah, that we're also going to put a fence around it. A short fence people can step over easily to keep the birds from coming up and pooping and whatever it is birds do.
Now are these over by the airstrip, the runway, on the West Trail, there's some great big gun mounts. Is that where they were?
Yeah. I don't know which ones these were particularly assigned to, but there's two 5-inch batteries that I've identified, and there's a 3-inch battery over that I've also identified, and I don't know which